Good morning. My name is Vivek Chilakuri, and I'm the Director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you for joining us. Today's virtual event is Countering the Digital Silk Road, Saudi Arabia. This is the fourth event in a series of case studies that CNAS has produced examining the U.S.-China tech competition in key emerging markets. And this is also the fourth virtual series that we've held as part of this broader project. And it couldn't have better timing. Earlier this year, in May 2025, President Trump traveled to Riyadh to announce a $600 billion investment deal, the largest ever such commercial deal between the two countries, underscoring Washington's recognition of Saudi Arabia's geostrategic importance, but also raising questions not only in Washington, but around the world about the challenges and risks of deeper technology cooperation with Saudi Arabia. On the one hand, an important energy and economic and political partner, and on the other, an authoritarian government with a poor human rights record and deepening ties to China. And so all of this raises fascinating and urgent questions about how the United States should compete with China and promote its own technology with an important country like Saudi Arabia at a moment of accelerating technology competition. And to help us unpack all of these questions, we have three terrific, distinguished speakers that I'll introduce, and we'll hope to have an open and free-flowing discussion about all of these issues. So I will introduce the three, and then we'll also invite the audience who are watching to ask any questions. So if you have questions, just drop them into the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them in the course of our discussion. So let me start by introducing our three speakers so we can get right into it. Mohammed is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and other emerging markets. He is the author of the forthcoming book, West Asia, A New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East, which will come out this November. He's also the director at McLarty Associates, a global advisory firm where he advises on policy matters at the intersection of tech, AI, finance, and energy. Mohammed, thanks for joining us. Karen House is our next panelist. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with nearly 5 decades of experience covering Saudi Arabia. Her deep expertise informs her latest book, The Man Who Would Be King, Mohammed bin Salman and the Transformation of Saudi Arabia, which draws on more than half a dozen in-depth interviews with the Crown Prince himself. Karen has spent over 30 years at the Wall Street Journal, serving as a reporter, editor, and ultimately its publisher. She is also the author of Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future. And last but not least, Dr. Mohammed Al-Sudairi is a lecturer in politics and international relations of the Arabic-speaking world. He holds a PhD in comparative politics from the University of Hong Kong, an MA in international relations and history from LSE and Peking University. Dr. Al-Sudairi's research focuses on the historical and contemporary connections between the Middle East and East Asia. So, as you can tell, we have an excellent and diverse panel with a range of experiences and perspectives for this discussion. So thanks all three of you for joining us. And Karen, let's just dive right in. I'll start with you. You've covered Saudi Arabia for many years as a journalist and an author. Can you help us set the scene for why Saudi Arabia matters to the United States and how you would summarize the history of U.S. company and private sector engagement in the kingdom since its founding?
Well, the relationship, I think, as people know, goes back to Franklin Roosevelt right before the end of World War II, meeting with Ibn Saud, the founder of this latest Saudi kingdom. But the business involvement began to really amount to something when the U.S. discovered oil in Saudi Arabia. So Americans have been, I would say, popular in Saudi Arabia for many decades. And I think the Saudis have found the American business ethics pleasing, and that's one of the differences, I would say, between the Chinese and the U.S. business involvement.
Great. Thanks for that, Karen. And Dr. Al-Sudairi, let's turn to you real quick. Can you give us a brief overview of the of how Saudi Arabia's ties with Chinese tech firms have evolved from the initial engagement and sort of the long period of no relations between the two countries to where sort of they stand today, to help us sort of set the scene here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Just two quick points before I delve into this question. One is I wanted to just express my solidarity with the people of Gaza and Palestine at a time of genocide being perpetrated by the Israeli state. Second, I just wanted to also highlight that I am a lecturer at Australian National University, just to know my institutional affiliation. Now, with regards to the question that you raised, Saudi Arabia is in many ways a unique state in the context of the Arab Middle East, in the sense that it was the last state to actually establish formal diplomatic ties with the People's Republic. This was around 1990. So prior to that, much of its scientific and technological engagement with the wider Chinese world was primarily centered with the Republic of China in the island of Taiwan. There was a lot of agricultural and technological initiatives in the 70s and 80s, as well as joint ventures that ultimately ended by the time Saudi Arabia recognized the One China principle. Now, from the 1990s onwards, there had been slow upticks in scientific and technological cooperation between the two sides, and that was primarily centered around state institutions. For example, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, with its equivalent in terms of the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology. Now, the real momentum begins to pick up under King Abdullah's reign, who ruled the kingdom from around 2005 to 2015. And he had kind of initiated his reign with an eastward turn in policy. I mean, one of the first destinations that he went to as a crowned monarch was to China, and a very famous and well-known trip. And since then, there has been an attempt to forge closer ties with state-owned enterprises in China, with technological institutions, and also increasing the allotment of Saudis going to study in China itself, right? So there was the very famous King Abdullah Scholarship Program that began around 2005, 2006, and cumulatively, we would say a few thousand Saudis had gone and graduated from Chinese institutions as a result of it. The major uptick really happens from 2016 onwards with Vision 2030. And here we begin to see the entrance of a lot of major Chinese technological firms, Huawei establishing a major presence in many different infrastructural projects in the kingdom, a lot of engagement with Chinese armament technological firms. For example, the first joint drone production facility in Al-Kharj was opened really in 2016 or thereabouts. So we can really read the intensification of technological cooperation as something that mirrors kind of the new developmental and reformist thrusts of the King Abdullah reign, as well as now the Salmanian reign, right? And this is really leading to this intense relationship between the two sides. I should just mention one last point, which is that China now is perhaps Saudi Arabia's second most important international partner when it comes to research and scientific work, right? And a lot of this is taking place through key institutions, as I mentioned, such as the King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, but also through very well endowed universities like the King Abdullah University for Science and Technology, which is in the north of Jeddah. And this institution was founded around 2009, has around 9 to 10 billion US dollars in terms of an endowment. So very, very well moneyed institution in many ways. And it has been a locus for building a lot of scientific links with Chinese universities. And you could argue that this was primarily due to the fact that two of its presidents were of Chinese background and origin. I mean, Tony Chan, who's very well known, and I'm sure you've encountered his name in your report when you were doing the research, was himself from the Hong Kong University for Science and Technology. And they drew in a lot of Chinese to come study in this institution, many of whom graduated, went back to the mainland, and continued to maintain very close collaborative research ties. So in many ways, we're entering a period of intense cooperation between China and Saudi. And this mirrors, I think, the overall development in the kingdom and should be read also in context where Saudi Arabia is also diversifying its research and scientific relationships all around the world. South Korea, Japan, Russia, the European Union. I'll stop there. I may have gone a bit too long.
No, it's good. It's a lot of good stuff, Dr. Al-Sudarian. Thank you for that. I mean, I should mention that, I think I mentioned at the top that a few days ago, CNAS, we released an in-depth case study on U.S.-China competition in the technology domain in Saudi Arabia. And we speak to a lot of the points that you just mentioned, Dr. Al-Sudari. I mean, 2016, I think, was a really important year. It was not only when MBS really announced Vision 2030, and technology is fundamental to Vision 2030. If you talk to, there's an official from SEDAIA, which is Saudi Arabia's, AI authority, that has said that 70% of Vision 2030's goals relate to AI and data. And if you actually read the plans and all the policies that have come out of the kingdom in the last even just 5 to 6 years, the raft of AI, data center, fintech, IoT, cloud, it all speaks to an ambition to put technology at the center of the kingdom's effort to transition from its sort of petro-economy to a more diversified technology rooted in advanced technologies and industries of the future. And, even though Huawei and ZTE actually forged deals with Saudi telecommunications companies as early as 2006, 2007, but the real acceleration, I think you're right, Dr. Al-Sudari, happened more recently in the past decade as Riyadh made these major investments as part of Vision 2030. But Karen, actually, let's come back to you and then we'll get to Mohammed Suleiman. But you've written, Karen, extensively about Mohammed bin Salman and Vision 2030, as I just mentioned. And can you give us a little bit more context about how technology fits into his broader project to diversify the economy and secure Saudi Arabia's role as a global power?
Well, as I'm sure all of you know, technology is the centerpiece. He intends to make Saudi Arabia the new Silicon Valley, and not just the technology capital for Saudi Arabia, in that Neom area that they're developing in northwest Saudi Arabia, where Israel, Jordan, and Egypt come together. And not just the technology capital for the Middle East, but for the world. The Saudis believe, because all of this AI and data centers are very energy intensive, that they are very competitive because they have the cheapest energy to produce, and they have a lot of land that is cheaper than land in the United States or other more crowded countries. So it's very important to him. And Saudi Arabia in the last 10 years has become incredibly digital. When I first started going, Saudi men were wearing their white thobes that had big pockets on each side, and everyone had their pockets bulging with bills. And now it is very hard to change a bill in Saudi Arabia. Everything is paid for by tapping your card on the charge machine, and they're very proud of being at the cutting edge of the most digital countries in the world. You can get a visa. They're trying to develop tourism. You can get a visa, by just doing it online. You can register a company quickly online. I mean, it's like Seoul, Korea now. Everything can be done quickly and digitally.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent reflection, Karen. I mean, you mentioned the cashless payments. I think in our research, 80% of most retail payments in Saudi Arabia now are cashless. And, this is a country where, thanks to $25 billion of investment from the government, 99% of the country is connected. That's not something we've achieved in the United States.
Right.
They have higher than average 5G speeds. As you mentioned, their public services have consistently pushed the frontier in terms of digital government and e-services in ways that might make, some folks in the rest of the world blush. So I think you're right. I think it's not just rhetoric. They're really putting their money where their mouth is and actually driving through reforms in the government.
And none of that existed before 2016. It's just a really dramatic change. Sorry, Vivek.
No, you're good, Karen. I mean, the pockets are maybe now bulging with, iPhone 17s and battery packs. But Mohammed Suleiman, let's come to you now. So, Karen mentioned the ambitions that Saudi Arabia has for AI and data centers, and the kingdom is building data centers at breakneck speed. Obviously, there was a lot of announcements in May related to this that we can get into. But beyond the headlines, what does Saudi Arabia actually want from all of these investments? Global prestige, economic diversification. Can you help shed some light on their motives here, Mohammed?
Thank you, Vivek, and congrats on your report, and I appreciate the kind invitation here. A few things. One, look, what Saudi Arabia is doing here is not just throwing money at a shiny tech projects. They are treating compute as a strategic asset, something that brings Saudi Arabia advantage, which is energy surplus, energy abundance, and space and committed capital into play. And with that, they want to transform the broader pillars of the Saudi economic system. So what I exactly mean by that? So Saudi Arabia historically very reliant on oil production, but they want to enter into a phase where they're able to export compute and AI tokens. And just basically, let me simplify the terminology. When you build this major compute clusters, this is clearly not only for your own domestic consumer base, this is also for you to export this sort of computational power to other markets around Saudi Arabia within the 2,000 miles latency. And so that means you're basically relying on AI clusters inside the kingdom to power your own utilities. And I think this is the way the Saudis are now thinking about this compute infrastructure. So instead of just exporting oil, we might basically see that one of the main exports coming out of Saudi is digital goods, AI tokens.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. And just sort of to build on that point and a point that Karen mentioned earlier, it's an imperfect parallel, but if you think about what, the neighboring UAE and Qatar have been able to do with the airline industry, where they had this vision of taking advantage of the geographic location of the Gulf vis-a-vis Europe and South Asia and North Africa and East Africa, to sort of make themselves a transportation hub and a logistics hub. I think but all of these countries, and including Saudi Arabia, obviously, see that possibility for data centers and cloud services by attracting huge hyperscalers from China, but from the United States, but also from China, to help provide lower latency cloud and other services, including AI, not just within the kingdom, but across the region and even beyond the Middle East, sort of to your point. Dr. Al-Saderi, let's come back to you. You've done a lot of research on Saudi-China scientific cooperation and technology cooperation. And one of the things that we try to examine in this report is sort of the comparative approaches of U.S. companies versus Chinese companies and their different histories in engaging in Saudi Arabia. Can you give us a sense of how Chinese companies have historically engaged in Saudi Arabia and what stands out about their approach, vis-a-vis how American companies perhaps have approached the market?
Well, I think in terms of, for example, the entry of companies, this could also arguably be applied to some of the American companies as well. There's always been kind of a political aspect to their involvement, for instance, in terms of the completion of projects and whatnot, especially if they're state-owned linked. There's a priority to complete it even at a loss. And this has been certainly a pattern in the earlier years of engagement, although now these companies are really kind of profit searching and eager to kind of reach their goal marks without necessarily taking into consideration that political aspect. I think a major difference between Chinese and American companies is the willingness of Chinese actors to indigenize technology and share it with Saudi equivalents. This is certainly something that follows the general Chinese kind of pattern that we see in many parts of the global South and many other places. This may change with time, especially if we're talking about technologies of a higher tier or at higher levels of scale. But in general, the pattern that has been quite appreciated in the context of the kingdom and even in the wider Middle East is this willingness to indigenize. The best example for this, or a classic example at this point, is really drone technologies, right? It's primarily because of export controls on the part of the US government in earlier years that has really allowed China to effectively take over the Middle Eastern market, right? And to create kind of joint ventureships and to really allow for local productive capacities to arise. I think another key difference, perhaps, and this is something that might cause difficulties of entry, even at the current moment and even looking ahead, is, of course, the differences in terms of human capital. And this is going to be a persistent problem, I think, looking ahead, in the sense that the Saudi workforce, right, that would be hired by these technological firms, the number of those who speak or have high proficiency in English and have considerable familiarity with managerial cultures in the US and elsewhere are far larger than those who had been trained in China, right? And you certainly see this. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal stories that I've heard, but also just simply internal reports that have been written about Chinese companies coming into the kingdom and really having difficulty hiring locals, right? Now, again, this is something that is undergoing change in the sense that the country is investing actively in Chinese as part of its national curriculum. There is, kind of more specialized scholarship programs to Chinese institutions. But the human capital issue is going to be kind of a long-term and surmountable challenge that will take time to deal with. So these are kind of maybe some of the differences that I can think of that one should take into consideration when thinking about the differences between the American and Chinese experiences.
Yeah, that's great context, Dr. Al-Sudairi. I think just a couple follow-on points that we sort of touch on a little bit in our report is the emphasis on indigenization or Saudization from Riyadh, I think, is interesting because, at least in our analysis, reflects, I think, a lesson from, the early history of the country and the early history of technology introduction in the country, where you had U.S. companies in the oil sector that were introducing and fully controlled a lot of the, the first computers and radios and television. And I think the country ahead of Aramco's sort of nationalization years later recognized that this was probably an untenable dependence on a foreign company for innovation, foreign country and companies for innovation. So I think Saudi Arabia recognizes that, one, indigenization and Saudization is important for its own long-term competitiveness and not recreating past dependencies, but also it recognizes that it has the capital, it has the political influence, and the geostrategic importance and the energy to make countries like the United States and China compete and accept some of the terms, not just countries, but the companies compete and accept the terms that it's set for local hiring. There are rules around establishing regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia for a lot of companies. And I think your point about how the U.S. companies have a much longer history in the region, and especially at the elite level and student level, there are far, far more Saudis, as you pointed out, that have studied historically in the United States. Although I think China is wised up to this, and those dynamics may be changing, including, with policy changing in the United States about our sort of openness to foreign students. But Karen, I mean, since that last point sort of touches on some politics here, it's not just a commercial relationship, of course, between the two countries. There's also a political and diplomatic history that informs all of this. And, you've studied this closely. And, U.S.-Saudi relations, I think observers would recognize, has cooled a fair amount during the Biden years and then, warmed up again under Trump. You could even argue they cooled under President Obama, warmed under Trump, cooled under President Biden, and warmed again under the second Trump administration. What factors do you think are explaining this sort of change across the administrations and as well as this recent upswing? And how would you sort of assess the relationship today?
I don't think the Saudis trust the U.S. And that goes back actually to George W. Bush not taking King Abdullah's advice on invading Iraq. But especially when in 2019, they had problems with Obama. But in 2019, when the Iranians bombed the Saudi oil facility at Abqaiq, and President Trump didn't really in any way retaliate against Iran. I think that's when the Crown Prince decided that, we have to look after ourselves with Iran, and decided to do what he ultimately did in 2023, restore diplomatic relations. So they weren't so great, I would argue, under the first Trump administration, at least after 2019. And, with Biden, he promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah for the Khashoggi murder. And, things were definitely not good under Biden. And, I at least thought when President Biden finally went there in 2022 to beg the Crown Prince to produce more oil to bring down prices and help the Democrats' midterm re-elections, that it was quite humiliating. As I say in my book, the prince humbled the president who had intended to humble the prince. It was not America's finest hour. And they shifted and tried to then produce the Israeli-Saudi diplomatic recognition. But I don't think the Saudis still trust us, and that's the reason you see, more association with China, which actually began, as Dr. Al-Sudairi said, you began in the 90s with diplomatic relations, but they reached out to China and bought missiles when the U.S. refused to sell them defensive protection. In 1985, Prince Bandar went to China secretly and did that deal, which outraged the Reagan administration when they found out about it. And that began the slow shift that Dr. Al-Sudairi discussed about China becoming the last, Saudi Arabia becoming the last country to recognize China. So I think we'll continue, long story short, we'll continue to see the Saudis using their money, power, and ambition to punch above their weight on the global stage and balance the U.S. and China and at some level Russia to keep the oil supply stable.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. And when we think about your point about capital, I think, and how Riyadh uses capital for its geostrategic purposes, like any state would, really punctuated by the May 2025 visit with President Trump, where you had the $600 billion investment deal between the two countries that I mentioned at the top of the event. And, Mohammed Salman, let me come to you. A key part of that investment deal was, the launch of Humane, Saudi Arabia's national AI arm, sort of trying to compete with G42 in the UAE. And, Humane has set an aspiration to train 7% of global AI, represent 7% of the world's AI training and inference by the end of 2030, which is it might not sound like a lot, but from where they're starting, it is a significant jump from where they are now. How realistic are these ambitions, and what do you think it would take for the kingdom to actually achieve them?
Let me add a caveat at the beginning of my answer to this question. So why we're discussing Saudi Arabia when it comes to AI? Like why Saudi Arabia and UAE and the Gulf more broadly are important to this growing AI ecosystem? For very simple technical reasons. One, for us to build the current compute capacity that we have globally, which is about 64, 65 gigawatts, it took us about 24, 25 years. And this was right before the rollout of LLMs and ChatGPTs of the world. For us to finance this sort of buildup, every gigawatt on the kit side, at least $10 billion. For you to put it inside a warehouse is basically almost anywhere between $30 to $35 billion. So this is not just a capital. This is really massive buildup. And if we want to keep up with the current pace of AI workloads, we need anywhere between 200 gigawatts to 300 gigawatts. So those are trillions of dollars. So the reason why I'm saying all of that, and back to your direct question, Is this ambitious? Absolutely ambitious. Is it impossible? I don't believe it's impossible. But you need to thread multiple needles at the same time. One, you need to sustain access to US chips, right? You cannot really go build up gigawatts of clusters inside the kingdom without a comprehensive agreement with the United States that makes sure that you have chips to sustain that buildup beyond 2027, 2028, until you're able to reach that sort of goal, and even sustain access to replacement chips to replace whatever you're going to be consuming. The second thing, you also need talent to able to sustain that sort of workload. And you have seen all the American corporations fighting over all these scientists and how this made all the news inside the United States. Having an AI scientist is a really big deal, and specifically their very specialized education from physics and math. 3, you also need to keep upgrading your energy ecosystem, right? This is not just I have 1 barrel of oil, therefore I'm able to train or do inference for compute. You need to have a very sustained, expansive electricity grid that also incorporate all sorts of renewables part of your ecosystem. And finally, if we agree that the Saudis want to be more on the gigawatts of compute, again, regardless of how there's going to be 5%, 7% of global compute, but it's gigawatts, right? 2 gigawatts by 2030, they want to be up to 6 gigawatts by 2034. You need to go convince emerging markets, companies, enterprises, governments that you can use my own clusters as a back end for your own AI inference. And that requires a company like Humane, because this is basically what we call like the hyperscaler businesses. This is why there are Google and Microsoft and those companies, because they have a base of customers and you're able to sell to them. So the challenge will be, can Humane have in partnerships, can grow to be that sort of company of choice for emerging markets? And let me put it back in full circle. So yes, I believe it's ambitious, but I think it's not impossible. I think they have multiple things that they have to check. But given the political commitment and the capital that they are putting behind this initiative, I think they're going to be able to hit closer to the mark.
Great, Mohammed. And just to follow up on that quickly, I mean, since we referenced the May 2025 deal a few times, I mean, it's been 4 or 5 months since that deal was announced. I mean, any sense of where that stands now?
I mean, my understanding is the Crown Prince is very likely to be visiting Washington, D.C. Sometime in the fall. And again, I don't pretend I'm a journalist or have any sort of high level sources, but you're going to have a lot of things that are stuck in bureaucracy in terms of frameworks, moving beyond MOUs into actual deals, actual implementation. So I would assume that some of those deals will be discussed more expansively between the technical teams.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Mohammed, I think I agree with you. But there was also a big deal announced with the UAE, of course, during that same trip, and the UAE is a little bit further ahead than Saudi Arabia in terms of launching G42 and having sort of the elite level expertise and frameworks compared to Saudi Arabia. Although Saudi Arabia has no shortage of ambition and capital to catch up, and even the Emirati deal is also still in formulation and negotiation in Washington. So if the Emiratis are struggling, at least as it appears, to conclude a deal with Washington, I imagine it would be that much harder from a technical and other perspective for the Saudis to do it. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, especially ahead of a potential visit in the fall. But I think, I wouldn't expect any massive breakthroughs imminently. And Dr. Al-Sadari, let's come back to you. China obviously is a huge part of our analysis and the conversation we want to have this morning. And, we've talked about whether it's in, whether drone technology or missiles or for tech. Saudi Arabia has often turned east, going back to, King Abdullah, I think, as you mentioned, when the West wasn't willing or able to offer things. And can you just give us a sense of the Saudi logic here, or, is it performative in the sense that they're reminding the United States that they have other options, or they actually seeking a genuine reorientation or rebalancing and partnership with China that isn't just about energy?
No, thank you. So I think maybe it'll be good to build on what Karen was saying a moment ago regarding kind of this lack of trust. I mean, I do think that one way of conceptualizing US-Saudi relations is that there has been a crisis of trust, and it's still ongoing in some ways. And I think the recent strike in Doha really underscores kind of the problems of dependence and kind of security guarantees from the US. And even now, kind of the current reporting on the Saudi-Pakistani Mutual Defense Pact treaty. I mean, some analysis presents it as an outcome of an alternative to the failure of reaching a security agreement with the United States, which would have offered kind of ironclad commitments on the part of the US to the national security and defense of Saudi Arabia. Now, I think the Saudi approach has been to try to enhance the kingdom's strategic autonomy by developing, for example, indigenous defensive capacity, diversifying security connections. And I think Pakistan's kind of role here underscores this move on the part of Saudi Arabia, rethinking kind of its engagement in its regional surrounding by reaching a détente with Iran. I mean, these are all part and parcel of kind of the instruments that Saudi Arabia is using to address the fact that there is a crisis of trust with the United States. Now, I don't think, I recently had a book that came out with Cambridge University Press called Narratives of Sino-Middle Eastern Futures. And I and my co-author, Dr. Andrea Giselli, we look at kind of the debates about the regional order and China's place within it among Saudi elites, Assadist Syrian elites of the overthrown regime, but also in China. And it's very clear that China, in many ways, at least by local actors, is used as a way to extract further concessions from the United States, right? Because the US-China Great Rivalry framework, it overshadows the thinking of strategists in Washington, D.C. But it's very obvious that local actors don't really seek China to become embedded in the regional system. I think their best outcome would be a regional order in which they have the strongest hand, like, say, a regional order dominated by Riyadh. And certainly their Chinese equivalents, and this is a really important point, don't have aspirations to enter into the Middle East theater, right? They don't have the same strategic calculations and interests as, say, the United States, nor do they want to be embedded in this regional order in any substantive way. Now, long term, and I think this is where I'll end, it's important to really emphasize that the one key point in your report, which is that there is an opportunity, but it is a fleeting opportunity for the US to really shape kind of the developments taking place technologically. Because ultimately, the US is really facing a bleak decade ahead. You know, in terms of your techno-industrial competition with China, wherever you look in terms of the actual raw data, things are not in the US favor, right? I mean, in terms of, for example, the global share of industrial production, China by 2030 is expected, according to UNDIP calculations, to approach the same level that the United States had in 1945, right? In terms of technology, if you look at the ASIP technology tracker, the congressional research reports that had come out in 2024, in so many technological categories, China is either ahead or peer-to-peer with the United States. And given your own internal self-destructive policies to your research ecosystem, and the lack of consensus on an industrial policy, it's probably that a reversal on the part of the US is going to be quite difficult to make. And so what's kind of the basic conclusion of all this is that you are ultimately able to enter and compete in these markets when you have something to offer, when you're at the forefront of technology, right? But if you are facing decline and your own house is not in order, it will be very, very difficult to actually maintain your advantageous positions in markets like Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, and even to compete effectively. So this is maybe kind of a thought to keep in mind. And even in industries where you have kind of an edge, like, say, semiconductor production and whatnot, I mean, nothing is really insurmountable. The Chinese are, a generation or two behind. And the development of alternative lithographs are very much possible. And in addition to that, I mean, the whole interesting developments that took place with the NVIDIA chip saga vis-a-vis China is very interesting because it shows how much the Chinese state is doubling down on indigenous production. So even there, where you have your own advantage and all the consequent impact it has on, say, computing power, which Mohammed had mentioned, might evaporate in a few years, right? I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dr. Alster. I think I agree with some, but not all of the characterization. And you actually anticipated one of the audience questions, which is, in the report, this is a question from David. We write that America's opportunity in the kingdom is fleeting, and could you expand on that? So you anticipated that and expanded on it. I don't know if Mohammed or Karen, you want to talk about it, but I'm happy to take a stab at it myself. I think to the extent that we wrote in this report that the opportunity is fleeting because in some ways we agree with your characterization that, I think specifically when it comes to AI and chip fabrication right now, the U.S. has a pretty formidable advantage vis-a-vis China, thanks to our export controls when it comes to the design and manufacturing of leading edge chips. Now, I think if we look at the history of 5G, of even legacy semiconductor fabrication, of biotechnology, we see that China has closed technology gaps that were once thought insurmountable and then found a way to get them to market at lower cost and outcompete Western alternatives. And I think it would be naive to imagine China won't figure that out for leading edge chips. To your point, Dr. Al-Sudari, at some point, I don't think it's 6 months. I don't think it's a year, but it's probably a couple of years. But, that suggests that the United States should feel a sense of urgency to go out and secure AI deals and technology deals around the world, but at the same time balancing reasonable concerns about security and human rights and IP protection. And these are not easy questions, and I think the administration is trying to strike this balance, and it's provoked a lot of debate, which is one of the reasons we're having this conversation. But I think more broadly, I'm pretty bullish on America's innovation and S&T ecosystem, even if I'm pretty bearish on our political system's ability to harness or at least not get in the way of all of those systems. Karen, please jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that point. I think what has made America is the freedom to innovate. The fact that we don't have an industrial policy like the Chinese with the government driving everything. And that's part of my concern about Trump now, is that he's trying to, put his hand into everything. That a lot of this conversation reminds me very much of what people said about Japan in the late 80s. America was a washed up country and Japan was the next superpower. And, the Japanese had been great at imitating, but less good at innovating. And, the Chinese are, I would say, somewhat the same, and they have a lot of other demographic problems, et cetera. While I'm got the floor, can I ask Dr. Al-Sudari a question, or both, Mohammed? Each of you've talked about human talent and the fact, Dr. Al-Sudari, that the Chinese have a somewhat tougher problem because more Saudis are conversant and comfortable with the American way of doing things. Is there enough human talent in Saudi Arabia, period? I mean, because it takes a long time to educate people at the very cutting edge. So is it a question of whether the talent is comfortable with China or the US, or just whether the talent exists, period, and how long it takes to get it to realize these big ambitions?
Well, Mohammed, do you want to jump in and take that, or Dr. Al-Sudari? Go for it.
Dr. Al-Sudari, please.
You can go ahead, Mohammed. I can pick up from.
I don't really have a solid view on your question. I think the one aspect I would push back on is the idea that China is good at imitating. I think this view I completely disagree with. I think this is a view that is not able and capable of seeing where China is today. We're speaking about a country that was able to start from a very low bar, producing things that are good enough at scale, and dominating so many industries that are critical to the techno-industrial base of today. We have seen this with solar panels. We have seen this with electrical vehicles. We are seeing this now with good enough chips on the Huawei Ascend AI chips. And we're even going to the low orbit satellite. So the idea that somehow China are only ahead or progressing because they're stealing IP and there's not really a Chinese innovation ecosystem. I full-heartedly disagree with this. I think they are a country that very much deserve respect for where they are today. And I think as an American, I would say there are a lot of things that China is doing when it comes to industrial policy that worthy of us to study and see what are the things that we should imitate as a country. And let's be frank here, China is a developmental model that so many countries all around Asia that looking up to and say we want to do what China is doing and the level of progress they have achieved.
And Mohammed, just to jump on your point quickly, I want to come back to you and talk about, the opportunity cost. Like, what is the actual risk of China's AI ecosystem, penetrating Saudi Arabia, to root the conversation back in Saudi Arabia, if the United States were, for example, not to conclude a deal with the kingdom? And maybe we won't get to yes, and we can talk about that. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of points on the workforce piece, Karen, since you mentioned. I mean, in the report, we actually dig into this a little bit with respect to semiconductors. So, the kingdom is making a big push for semiconductor fabrication and design. I think our assessment is that they recognize that they're not going to be able to bootstrap a fabrication and design ecosystem to compete at the leading edge. I mean, that's something even the United States is struggling to do when it comes to fabricating stuff at the leading edge, which is why we had a Chips and Science Act a few years ago. But I do think they're focusing on legacy chip fabrication and fabless chip design. And all of that's to say they know they need people. And I think that perhaps the best indication of sort of the shortcomings of the domestic talent pool in Saudi Arabia at the moment is that the way that they've designed through their national semiconductor hub to bring people in is to actually draw on regional talent, not Saudi talent in the short term, people from Pakistan, from North Africa, from Eastern Europe, as a bridge for helping propel the design ecosystem until they can train enough people within Saudi Arabia to assume that leadership. So I think it's a recognition that they don't have the people right now, and they need foreign partnerships to do that. So that was a long tangent to get back to the question, Mohammed, which is, how do you actually assess the Chinese AI stack and what it could offer Saudi Arabia? Sometimes there's an argument made that if we don't make a deal with Saudi Arabia on AI, China will fill the gap. Is that realistic?
So this is a very, very, very important question. You know me, Vivek, I have been on I would say, the camp of engineers who are saying there is a Chinese stack and that's able to deliver at scale. And the news are very clear. We have the China Cyberspace Administration yesterday just telling Chinese companies, please do not really buy the low-end chip coming from the United States. We don't need this because we already have good enough chips. So let's go through the infrastructure layer of the Chinese stack. They have the Huawei Ascend AI chip right now, and we know that they have been marketing the chip to Southeast Asia and Middle Eastern countries. They have the equivalent of NVIDIA Coda, which is called Khan, and this is basically their own computational software platform, not the same scale as Coda, of course, but they have that. On top of that, we have seen the DeepSeek chain of thoughts model being widely used, of course, locally, because they have enough compute to operate this at scale. So at every layer of the AI stack, there is a Chinese equivalent, and it's good enough. Then the second part of this is we're speaking about a country that's capable very well of producing things at a scale the moment they are hitting or able to escape the bottleneck. We have seen this with a lot of industries, 4G hardware and then 5G networks. We have seen this with EV, we have seen this with batteries, we have seen this with solar panels. So any sort of assumption that this will not really take place with some of the main bottlenecks in the chip ecosystem, I think that this is very misplaced. I mean, also yesterday, we also heard that the Chinese are trying to deploy / they're testing the deep ultraviolet equivalent of ASML. So even on every aspect of the ecosystem that we know very well that they were behind on, they're very much trying to test new models, they're trying to test new products, they're trying to make sure that they're able to produce at scale. And if this is the broader ecosystem of China today, why we should assume that this AI stack will not be deployed at scale in emerging markets from Southeast Asia, South Asia to the Middle East. I think it's a very fair assumption that this stack will be deployed somewhere in those emerging markets if we are not able to offer them things that they need. And let's be frank here, one of the things that I find frustrating in Washington is there's this assumption that we only have to give crumbs. We have to give things that are second and third tier when it comes to quality. And this is not really what nations who are going through a major socioeconomic transformation, technological transformation want, specifically if they have the capital and the finances to able to go somewhere and get what they need to able to do a major development for their tech ecosystem.
Yeah, Mohammed, thanks for that. And we actually have a bunch of questions from the audience that I should get to, and I will ask a few in a second. But just to build on your point, Mohammed, and mostly agree with you, I think I would break out, when we think about emerging markets, I would put countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia in one category because they just have, capital reserves and, sovereign wealth funds and a system of government that can deploy it according to state interests in a way that a lot of other emerging markets, like think of a Kenya or Malaysia, don't necessarily have. And your point, I think good enough is actually what China has used in a lot of other domains to be extremely effective at promoting their technology around the world. But for Saudi Arabia and the UAE and maybe a few others, they don't want good enough. They want best in class, and they have the money to purchase it. So I think there have to be sort of tailored strategies for different markets. But let's go to an audience question, which Dr. Al-Sudairi or Karen, you're welcome to take. This is a question from Hannah. The Trump administration struck AI and chip deals with both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. How would you assess their relative abilities to become a global compute power as they aspire to be? We touched a little bit on this, but maybe you can elaborate. Dr. Al-Sudairi, do you want to take this potentially?
Yeah, I could touch it in passing and then maybe address the workforce question.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I also have to say that I completely agree with Mohammed's assessment in general. I think the Americans in the Beltway have a lot of ideological blinkers, and it's unfortunately impeding a sober assessment of how much the techno-industrial balance is changing. At least this is how I see it. To claim that you're bullish on American innovation, fine, but there are also the realities of a political economy in the US that has a lot of structural problems and needs sustained reform. Intervention by the state, intervention by other actors. But okay, putting all that aside. Regarding the AI deals, I do think Saudi Arabia and the UAE have made considerable headway and commitments. I mean, Mohammed has spoken a bit about it, but all of them have, for example, their own AI systems. I think in Saudi Humane, Jusair in the UAE, one could even add Fanar in terms of Qatar. They have all been trying to develop computing power. And in fact, there has been a recent report that came out about global data centers that ranked Saudi Arabia, well, the UAE and then Saudi Arabia as second and third in terms of global rankings based on AI deployment, cross-sectoral usage, as well as in terms of available computing power. So I think, given the centralized kind of power of the state, its serious investment of resources, and the agility of the bureaucracy in terms of actually pursuing these projects, I think they can very well become AI players, right? Not necessarily at the very top, but certainly in the middle points of the value chain. And regarding the workforce question, I think, the Saudi population, which is approaching 20 million based on the last statistics, Saudi nationals, that is quite an educated population. I mean, we're living with the dividends of the King Abdullah scholarship program that had sent anywhere between 300 to 500,000 Saudis to be educated wherever they'd like, right? And these are now the technocrats in the Saudi bureaucracy. These are the people who are running startups. These are the people who are filling up the PIF incubated companies. In terms of now the specialized niches, for example, in relation to AI, I think the government is poaching talents, very much like Silicon Valley does anyway. It's no different really over there. And it's also doing specialized programs to train Saudis, right? Having these national level programs to try and encourage people to consider this as an arena. I'm bullish, perhaps, when it comes to the demographic and workforce questions, if only because I think the Gulf and many other places will probably be very effective in doing the transition to automated forms of production. I think, the government is trying to push, for example, dark factories. There is a lot of promotion for minimizing the need for human intervention. So there can be kind of a more specialized approach when it comes to the workforce question and their training that addresses these, right? I don't think the demographics or the limitedness of the pool is necessarily going to be a problem for capital-rich countries, right? They can actually industrialize now because you don't actually technically need to have a major labor force anymore, theoretically speaking, if you know how to deploy this capital, utilize certain technologies.
Mhm.
At the same time, they have a very large young population that needs good paying jobs. And, so even though they might be faster at automation because of reasons we can talk about, that might pose, even if they don't have a democratic system, domestic challenges that are political nonetheless. But Mohammed or Karen, did you want to come in on that? Otherwise, we'll go to another question.
No, he answered the question.
Great.
I agree with Dr. Suderi quickly here on the way he framed the AI talent question. The idea that your AI talent is going to be exclusively your own nationals, I would say is very much like an old idea. I mean, this is not even something that we do here in Silicon Valley or in the other big tech hubs, including here in Virginia. You basically very much rely on global talent, folks who already studied in your educational system, or folks who are here on different visas to be joining those AI labs. So that model, specifically in the Saudi context and the Gulf context at large, has been the case for other traditional industries. The only difference is you're going to be more targeted in terms of AI talent and trying to be much more expensive to include more talent from other countries outside the Middle East as well.
But Mohammed, do you think, just to not push back, but to follow up, do you think that Saudi Arabia will struggle more than, for instance, the UAE in attracting that foreign talent? I mean, I think even though we were actually, I should mention, me and some colleagues were in Riyadh in February to do research for this case study, and the level of, I'd never been to Saudi Arabia before, but of course, as an American, you have a certain impression for how things are over there, and the reality is very different. Things clearly are changing dramatically on the ground, and the level of sort of societal and economic reform is hard to overstate. Nevertheless, that perception exists in a lot of places where Saudi Arabia would want to draw talent from, in Europe and Asia and the United States, whereas I think people view the UAE a little differently. Do you think that's a comparative advantage for the UAE when it comes to attracting foreign tech talent?
I don't really put it as UAE versus Saudi Arabia on the AI question, to be honest. I think those are two distinct countries with two distinct trajectory. And eventually, you're going to see more of a GCC AI cluster sometime in the future in an organic way. And the reason why I'm saying that, think about this. You have the President of the United States in Riyadh with a whole line of tech CEOs waiting in line to have a handshake with the Crown Prince. Why is this about? This is about a country that has decided that it wants to be a compute partner to the United States. And when talent anywhere see that this is the direction of the country, of course, this country will be appealing to them to be working on some of the most exciting AI deployment that this country is trying to work on.
Great. So we're close on time. Karen, I want to come to you with the last question to close us out and maybe look prospectively to end our discussion here. So, you've studied the kingdom for a long time. What do you recommend to U.S. policymakers who are actually looking to build a constructive and durable tech partnership with Saudi Arabia, given sort of the challenges and opportunities that we've discussed in this conversation?
I think Americans need to understand that everybody isn't like us and doesn't necessarily want to be like us. We believe in religious freedom. It's not something that the Saudis practice. We are big on human rights. They are not. But it's a different history and a different culture. And we can't change that. So I think if we manage to work with the Chinese, and Xi Jinping is a far more vicious autocrat than the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Same with Iran, same with Russia. So we just need to decide, in my view, what are our interests and how do you provide a reliable partnership with somebody, because I think that's what they want, and it's in our interest for Mohammed bin Salman to succeed at moderating Islam and modernizing the country. He doesn't want to westernize it, but we would be beneficiaries along with the kingdom and the whole world if that happened.
Great. Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks to Mohammed Suleiman and Dr. Al-Suderi for this lively and timely conversation. I think we barely scratched the surface on a lot of these issues, and I think regardless of what the United States and China do, it's quite clear that MBS and Riyadh and Saudi society are undergoing a historic and technology-driven transformation that I think is up for grabs in terms of which countries are going to be a part of that and how they're going to shape it in partnership with the kingdom. So thanks everybody for joining us virtually, and I hope people stay tuned. We have a final report following our 4 case studies that will be coming out and taking a global view of the question of how does the United States do a better job of countering China's digital Silk Road and actually promoting secure and democratically aligned alternatives around the world, including in places like the Gulf. So thanks everyone for joining us, and please stay tuned for more from CNAS.
Thank you.